purchase items in the pouch in front of you.
Have a safe and informative journey.
Hello, I'm Nathan Hartman, and this is Dreamfinders, a podcast about the creative culture of Disney theme parks. Today I want to start by talking about urban legends. You know, those tales whispered from one person to another without any actual facts to back them up? Legend has it they always seem to start. Well, Disney isn't without its share, and the granddaddy of them all is about Walt Disney himself. You've heard it. The body of Walt Disney is frozen and stored somewhere on company property, waiting for science to catch up. It's nonsense, but this one loves to stick around because if anybody would have figured that one out, it would probably be the guy who created Tomorrowland. Urban legends, of course, evolve over time, and my guest today is throwing his hat in the ring with his own version of the Waltcicle. Benjamin Lancaster is the writer and director of The Further Adventures of Walt's Frozen Head, a feature-length comedy about a Disney World cast member that takes the disembodied but very much alive head of Walt Disney on an adventure through the Magic Kingdom. Benjamin runs us through his inspirations for the film, shooting on location and finding just the right Disney legend to play Walt Disney. All of that and more is coming right up on Dreamfinders. Ben Lancaster, great to have you on Dreamfinders.
Oh, thank you very much for having me, Nathan.
So let's start with what brings you here, your new film, The Further Adventures of Walt's Frozen Head. For those listening who might not have heard about it, give us a little pitch about what this whole thing is about.
The Further Adventures of Walt's Frozen Head is a family comedy, which takes, I don't want to say takes seriously because that's really not the point of the film, but takes as its premise the idea that Walt was indeed frozen after his death in 1967 and is currently being thawed out every year to give advice to the current CEO of the Disney company. He's kept underneath the Magic Kingdom, but he has never been allowed up to see the park. And so he talks a low-level Magic Kingdom employee into taking him one day. And the film is the adventures that they go on.
So a project like this is not something that I would say someone not dedicated to Disney in general would do. What are your youngest memories of Disney and the parks?
I grew up in the Midwest, and for Disney World was very much that Mecca vacation that my family took twice when I was young, and then really never again. I think I was 5 and 7, and then it was until I was really an adult before I had visited the park again. But those two trips, sold me on the concept of this is what I'm interested in. This is what I want to do with my life. This is how, this is how I want to, this is what I want to learn about. And so very early on, I was going to the library and checking out the guidebooks, not because I was planning a trip, just because I wanted to read about the changes that had happened to the park in the last year. This was early internet or pre-internet days. And that was sort of my fix at a very young age. I was just absolutely hooked on the parks from the very beginning.
I totally understand that. I'm also from the Midwest, and it was that same sort of mecca where I think we went 4 times maybe my childhood, and each time it's like this encased thing that you try to remember every little detail, and you have your dad's VHS like camera oriented copy of whatever they got when they were there, things like that. So you're always digging for stuff, and that's totally understandable. What sort of led you into an interest in the history? Clearly the parks are something that you had interest in, but I don't imagine you go into this project without some sort of love for the history of the company and Walt, of course, as well.
I really think that it was Jim Hill Media, the site that I was on pretty much continuously in the early 2000s, that really led me. I was reading about the parks, and then there would also be the occasional article that would really dive back into some of the history, and that really lit a spark in me, and I think that started me thinking about the parks even deeper in a way that these were people who created a thing in a certain time in a certain place, and we still have elements of those things, and you can kind of even pick it apart like an archaeologist would. To me, the parks are so fascinating too, because you have, how like in archaeology, if a city gets flattened, they'll build another city on top of it in 30 years or whatever. Well, right. In the parks, we have like, this plan was instituted, and then 5 years later, a new manager came in, and this plan started to get instituted. And we have these long, intricate histories that we can sort of suss out by looking at just how the parks are today, and then knowing the history of where they came from. And then that makes sense that why that gift shop is located right there, and why that little DVC booth is just sticking out in the middle, because it used to sell tickets, or something like that. And it was just a whole other park ecosystem. So that just started as much as I loved the theme parks themselves, learning the history just gave me such a bigger depth. And then you just link into the character of Walt himself. Like, he's the most fascinating person of the 20th century in my mind. You can't overstate his influence. And had he done to me, he was a genius like 3 times. Disneyland was obviously the genius move that should have earned him a place in whatever Hall of Fame on its own. Steamboat Willie and Snow White. All 3 of those individually would have been enough to call your life's work, but he did all 3 of them.
According to your IMDb, you've directed 5 films and you've written several. What age did you start to have interest in the craft of filmmaking?
6. I wasn't always necessarily thinking of myself as a filmmaker, but really as a storyteller. And even today, I do film, because it sounds weird to say, but like, you can do independent film and you can't build an independent theme park, if that makes any sense. I can kickstart a film. It gets a lot harder to kickstart a larger interactive theme-based attraction or something like that. So I've done film, I've done radio drama, I've done theater, I've done a lot of different things that are all sort of tangentially related, but ultimately I kind of am a storyteller.
What early films and other sort of stories did you find so influential on the artist that you became?
It's cliche to say, but if you're a kid growing up in the 80s, you're a huge fan of the Spielberg Zemeckis sort of era. But beyond that, it may have been the age I came up. I never really grew that love of like new Hollywood 1970s cinema. So to me, there were 2 bits of cinema. There was the stuff in the 80s that was made by Spielberg, and then there was the stuff in like the 50s and the golden age of Hollywood cinema, where these comedies have this really particular sort of artificial bent to them. And even the dramas always have their sort of level of artificiality, but it's in a way that's stylized that in my mind is really this classic form of cinema. And so I really loved both of those 2. And that's sort of where my influences all come from.
So in 2009, you directed what appears to be your first feature, and correct me if I'm wrong, Finding Xanadu, The Life and Films of Samuel W. Truss.
Yes.
And this film is a mockumentary of sort of an Ed Wood type terrible director. What inspired this?
That was inspired by a sign that I passed quite often, and there was always a slight variation, but I got a master's degree at Ball State University in Muncie, Indiana, which is a fairly small town. But as you drive to and from Muncie, you drive through a lot of smaller towns. And each one of them has a sign that says, whatever Indiana, home of fill in the blank. No one has ever heard of this fill in the blank most of the time. But they all have their sort of local hero. And so I wanted to tell the story about a filmmaker who was the hero of a very small town that maybe exaggerated his talent and his abilities, but they were very proud of him because he was from their small town. So as the story was as much of an unfolding as this lost film that they had found. It was my first feature, and it is a very flawed film, but there are definitely sections I love from it, and it definitely brought me to where I am today. So
I think that's very interesting. I I spent some time in Huntington, Indiana, which is not very far from Ball State. And we have a sign very similar because we're the hometown of Dan Quayle. So, yeah, for sure, this idea.
He was vice president, though.
Yeah, that's something.
You actually
something.
know who he was.
Yeah, apparently couldn't spell potato, but he was vice president. So I can gravitate towards that. What I find interesting about Finding Xanadu and it being a part of your filmography is you seem drawn to make films about creatives, whether they're fictitious like Truss or real like Disney. Why do you think that is?
I really don't know off the top of my head. That's something I would have to pay some money and sit on a psychiatrist's couch to find out. I think that every filmmaker tends to make their one usually bad film about filmmaking, and then they realize that people who don't make films are less interested in the topic than they are. So, the Further Adventures of Walt's Frozen Head is kind of having my cake and eating it too, in that you get to make a topic about storytelling and a storyteller without making it about the, art of filmmaking or whatever that has a more limited interest range, I think. I don't know. I've always been drawn to those stories of plucky individuals fighting the odds, though, and that's when you get a lot of filmmakers. That's sort of what they are. It's really that one person who inspires a group to go out and do something.
Well, that's very true, of course, for Disney. So let's talk a little bit about Walt's Frozen Head. What inspired? Well, I sort of have an idea of what inspired the concept, as it is sort of an urban legend. But tell us a little bit about your experience learning about that urban legend, and then what inspired the rest of the film.
I don't want to say this is a film is based on, because in no way is this legally based on anything created by the Walt Disney Company.
But of course.
But of course. There was a film that was in production in the 1960s when Walt died, called Khrushchev and Disneyland. I don't know if you're familiar with the film or the true story behind it.
I know aspects of the story.
Okay. The true story is that the premier of the Soviet Union came to L.A. and was not allowed. Disneyland was on his itinerary, and at the last minute, the security force patrolling him around, which was having enough trouble as this was, pulled it, and he threw a public fit about not being allowed to go to Disneyland. Walt, being the entrepreneur that he was, wanted to capitalize on this and make a film in which he snuck out of his hotel for an evening at Disneyland. I love that idea. I wish they would still go ahead and make that movie, and I'm available, Disney Corporation. I've done it once. You won't even notice, I promise. I just thought this was so humorous and so funny and so clever of an idea that when the idea of making a film about Walt's Frozen Head came up, the other idea of disguising it and sneaking it into Disney World just seemed like such a natural fit. And so with that, a lot of the elements of the film really fell into place. The idea itself of the film was really just a bunch of us in film school kicking around different titles. It wasn't even an idea, it was a title. And the title kicked around was The Further Adventures of Walt's Frozen Head, and it's been titled that ever since.
So from these early origins of sort of pitching around this idea with film school friends, you end up financing this project, like many filmmakers through Kickstarter. But unlike many filmmakers on Kickstarter, you actually found backers. And what has your relationship been with the Disney fan community through this whole process?
We started the Twitter account Walt's Frozen Head. Let's see, it was in September, and I think we first asked for money in like May. So I knew that there was no way I was going to be able to convince the Disney fan community that I was one of them if I didn't get into the Disney fan community before asking for money. So generally it's just been an incredible experience making real friends. That's the most surprising part to me. I kind of knew that I thought, hey, maybe this could become popular. Maybe people would find this funny and start following it, and then maybe they'd donate to the Kickstarter. And the amazing part is also just really meeting these people and getting to develop some serious friendships. through Disney Twitter. It's a fun place.
Writing is always difficult, and much less when you have a character that is sort of one of the most recognizable people in the world. But the thing about Walt is he was a little bit of a blank slate when it comes to his public persona, right? A bit of a happy uncle. Did you strive for the real Walt, or did you lean towards the persona when you were making the film?
I really tried to get into Walt's head. And my primary reference source, which I know some people in the Disney fan community are a little about, is the Gabler biography, that like massive one.
The Tomb, basically.
And, yeah. It's not the most flattering view of Walt, and at the other hand, it's not the most critical view of Walt. It's really a fairly balanced view. He plays armchair psychologist in a way that I admit it annoys some people, but I found very useful in trying to really capture that persona. So that's really where I drew a lot of my inspiration from. So throughout the film, Walt is going back and forth depending on the circumstance. So some strangers walk into a room and discover him for the first time, and instantly it's that old Uncle Walt persona. He just turns it on. And then they leave and he turns it back off and talks to, Peter, his employee, who he, doesn't have to impress at that point. So I'm trying to play that balance there of, what is a very private man, a little bit, not grumpy, but a little bit gruff maybe at times, with that very warm Uncle Walt public persona that he really can just turn on and off like a switch.
Yeah, and with such a role, you really need like someone who understands Disney. And tell me a little bit about casting for that role.
We could not have asked for a better Walt. We'd shot the entire film without knowing who Walt was. So our main actor is just talking to a head with a green panel in the front of it that we know we're going to composite the head of whoever we cast in the future in. We had our VFX person on board by that point, and had gotten that ball rolling, and we kind of had put out a call to a few different celebrities of varying levels. And we decided, why don't we I had actually met Ron at a book signing event. I don't think he actually remembers that, but I did, and I bought his book. And I read through his book and thought, let's just ask if he's willing to do an audition. That's all it was. We got that audition tape back, and we knew that was Walt. Like, there was no other question. We didn't have to look at anybody else. We were willing to offer him the role right then. He just really found a way to channel the public persona. It's not a mimicry. It's not like an impression. It really is how you imagine if you were just talking to Walt, though.
And for those who might not know, the Ron you're speaking of is Ron Schneider, who
I didn't.
No, it's
Ron Schneider.
It is a pretty nerdy podcast, so I'm not too worried. But at the same time, Rod Schneider is a rather famous Disney cast member. He's known for his role as the original Dreamfinder in Epcot, among many, many other things. How did you find that his experience working for the company affected his portrayal? Did it in any way that, say, an actor who had no experience as a cast member, they wouldn't be able to latch on to the same sort of persona?
In several times in the phraseology, because he came back to me with some notes on the script, which, we were very thrilled about, because he has a depth of knowledge from working with the company that I've never worked for the company. All my research is books and discussion. We had several people who do work for the company consult on the film, but I don't have that firsthand experience, and I certainly don't have the firsthand experience that he does, as he was there opening day of Disneyland. So he really brought a depth to the role and sort of the phraseology of Walt that I don't think any other actor would have been able to bring. So I was just immensely thankful. Like even the way certain lines were phrased, he was like, "Well, can we try it out this way?" Or can we do it? And yeah, sure, Ron. Like let's get it. Let's try it out. And that was all within the confines of the other half of the conversation, which had already been filmed. So that was really a level of talent on his part. So it was really a great collaboration.
Let's talk a little bit about that CGI heavy aspect of your film. Clearly you didn't literally cut Rob's head off for the role, maybe he would have been game. He seems a very game kind of person. But what was that process like in filming his side of the story?
So we had, partially because several of our scenes were times that we just had to get it quickly. We didn't have all the technical information you might like from to do all that CGI, so a lot of it was eyeballing. Our VFX supervisor, who was going to be doing the majority of the effects, was there on set the entire time, and it was with us standing over a computer screen with some protractors and some angle measurements, and then saying, "Okay, just rotate Ron a little bit." And we discovered very quickly that moving the camera was more difficult than just moving Ron. So it was move Ron a little bit to the left, or Ron, can you rotate a few degrees to the right? And the camera is rarely above or below. It's normally in angle sort of on the horizon. So there was a lot of just like scoot, and then if we needed to raise or lower the camera, we typically did that. But he was on a wheelie office chair the whole time, and had a backdrop just right behind his head that was bright red, so we could key out or take out all the reds afterwards to really darken that up. It was a fun experience shooting for 3 days on a soundstage.
And the rest of the film, as you said, you had already completed, and a portion of that, of course, was filmed inside of the parks without permission. They let you in the door as they let anyone in, but they didn't necessarily.
We paid for our tickets.
Exactly.
So.
Yeah. This is the thing a few other films have done with kind of a mixed bag of success. There is, of course, Florida Project, which does a small scene, and a couple others. Did you watch any of those for ideas of what was viable in the parks?
I watched Escape from Tomorrow when we were discussing it early, and I knew that was going to be because I was making this as part of my MFA through UCF, and they were very graciously giving us equipment. I did have to have a level of like justification for how I'm going to pull this off. And whenever anyone said like, "This is impossible, you can't do it," I said, "Well, they did." So that was a very good proving ground for us to say like, this is possible. I'd watched that. I watched Exit Through the Gift Shop, which is just so completely different that it wasn't really an inspiration necessarily. It was odd because with Escape from Tomorrow specifically, I was surprised how restrained they were in some ways, that they really mixed the two parks. It was definitely not a film made for anyone who had, nagging questions about where they are in the park or, knowledge of how things are actually laid out or logistics or anything like that. And that was something I knew that we were going to have to nail. So in some ways, we really hewed more to the truth of where, locations are and things like that. And then there was just a lot of scouting trips. I would stand there and, sit for a while, play on my phone and count how many cast members were walking by and what kind they seemed to be. And then we did a large scouting trip with one of the producers and the director of photography. And we went through all of the locations and I mapped out the risk levels, and they chose the most risky ones every single time. It's like, yeah, but the light's better over here. Yes, but people keep walking by. We were very fortunate in our in the risky choices that we made, that we had a great success in actually pulling off what we needed to.
Tell us about one of those risky choices.
Center Street, which is fairly abandoned most of the time. You know where I'm talking about, across from the kind of offset entrance to the Emporium. Kind of has the table and chairs back there. I think our DP was really pushing for it, and it is this kind of quiet and out of the way spot, except the fact that that's a major cast member thoroughfare. So like, not only are you not hidden by the crowds, but people keep coming by one after another. We did have some security guards who were interested in us near the Tangled bathrooms, and so we had to call it a day, or and not a day, but a shoot, and come back in a few hours later. So there were times that we had to sort of pack up and move on. We had some codes and signals and things worked out, but generally we moved like a pretty well-oiled clock through the whole thing.
Did you have any moments where you had to improvise, where you had to change location or an action or something that you just thought wouldn't work in the moment?
The biggest issue that we ran into was getting through the turnstiles, because as part of the film, the main actor has sort of put a Band-Aid over his finger, so he has to use a different finger, right? So they can't track him going into the park, essentially. So this was something we knew was going on. He was coached on, how to go through it. Not a problem. He's going to get through it. The trouble is he's a local actor. I shouldn't say just local. He's actually been in several films since, and is really a rising talent. But he does a lot of local theater. And the cast member recognized him and wanted to have a conversation right there while we're rolling. So we're shooting probably 10 feet away, and that's probably our least inconspicuous because we're looking straight at the guy, and the cast member wants to have a fairly protracted conversation with who he thinks is his friend, Daniel Cooksley, the actor who's playing Peter. And so Daniel really is just having to improvise as best as possible, and this is one of our very first shoots. So I'm just, sweating bullets over, standing to the side and waiting to see exactly what happens. But he walked through the gates, and we intercut it with some reaction shots from the actress who's playing his daughter, and it works. So we really had an additional tension in the footage that we weren't necessarily planning.
Tell us a little bit about the actual shooting of the production day, because clearly everyone has phones now and everyone's shooting everything, and it's there are vloggers. There's not 20 years ago someone would be like, oh, what are they doing? Like, there's only so many people who have big cameras here, right? It's much different now, and I think that's why doing something like this is possible. What sort of camera did you guys use, and how did you bring a casualness to what was actually a probably hectic production day?
It didn't wind up being nearly as hectic as we thought. The early kind of missteps aside, we really had a very smooth shoot, remarkably smooth. We were using a Blackmagic Pocket Cinema camera for the park shoots, which is incredibly small and inconspicuous, and it gave us just fantastic footage. My faculty advisor, who was the woman who produced Major League and Tremors and a few other, worked on a bunch of Hollywood films, looked at our footage, and I think she said something to the effect of, this may not be the first film shot in the park, but it's the first film shot in the park that's going to look decent. So we're really proud of the image quality we captured there with this very inconspicuous camera. And then it was a lot of pre-planning. Like, we spent 3 times as much pre-planning for those days as we did actually in the park. And that was on a studio with the areas mapped out on the floor, knowing exactly what we needed, exactly what shots we had to getting them and moving on.
You mentioned production. You mentioned doing sort of prep work before going out and doing these shoots. When you did your research, when you watched these other films, did you feel like there were ways that you could improve the guerrilla style, the actual style of filmmaking, as you studied other attempts?
Definitely. I don't know how each of those was necessarily accomplished. But to me, the goal when you're doing any sort of special effect, and in my mind, this was essentially pulling off a special effect, is that you try and shoot it as close to how you would just normally shoot it as possible, and then you try and figure out how you're going to accomplish that. That's like why the dinosaurs in Jurassic Park still hold up, because Spielberg just shot it how he wanted to shoot it and then made the special effects people figure out how. So for us, it was a lot of like, if this was just happening in front of us, if we could have all the permission in the world, how would we go about shooting this? And then we just figured out ways that we could do that. And yes, a lot of it was, okay, we've got to be slightly clandestine about this, so let's sort of hide the camera across the place, and you look like you're shooting up there, and then at the last minute move it into position. But the cinematography style itself is really supposed to harken back to the classic Hollywood style. Like, that's what we were going for the entire time. We want it to look like That Darn Cat. We want it to look like, The Absent-Minded Professor and those sort of films. There was an intentionality behind the aesthetic style, which there were times we had to compromise that because we're shooting in the park and we're trying not to be noticed. But for the most part, we really think we pulled it off.
So one of your credits is working on a travel documentary called Vagabond, Indiana. Do you feel like your background in doing nonfiction storytelling helped you in the pre-planning or even production phases of such a sort of weird on-the-spot guerrilla shoot?
Yeah, that's a good point. That may very well have influenced. To me, though, it's really more about a theater background. That's really, and especially working with two people who had that theater background as well. Daniel, the theater actors are great because they get the difference between stepping out on stage and go, and then versus a lot of times the movie actors are have to take a minute and no, the curtain's up, Daniel. So yeah, Daniel was great about that. Kate was great about that. Kate, the girl who plays his daughter, Kate Jenkins, and they were just both with this heavy theater background and could turn it on and walk into their roles and do what they needed to do and then turn it off. And that comes from, we did this in rehearsal. You just draw on that, you pull it out, and you do it again.
It's interesting because in many ways, it feels like the actors are sort of playing two roles, right? They are both the characters that they are playing as the camera rolls, and then also casual people being casual, right? And not trying to draw attention to themselves. Did you have discussions about that aspect of the shoot, or did that sort of come naturally with their backgrounds?
I think that came pretty naturally for them. Part of it is we're not doing anything that people aren't necessarily doing in the parks. Now, granted, maybe you don't film the arguments that you have with your daughter, but people are arguing, people are raising their voice and that sort of thing. In the Disney parks, people are having kind of fights and discussions and things along those lines. And then, part of that was also trying to make the camera a little more inconspicuous. We were not recording sound in the parks. That was all done in post-production.
Let's talk a little bit about lighting, because clearly a major aspect of filmmaking is lighting, and that's definitely something you can't even, it's not even really an availability to put like a small LED light on top of a camera when you're doing what you're doing. How did you deal with that? Was it as kind of you just dealt with the sun where the sun was at? Did you sort of pre-plan for certain attractions or other locations you knew you were going to be at? What were your thoughts on that?
So we had kind of two plans set out, one for, really overcast day and then one for a full sun day. And luckily we got more of the overcast than we probably deserved. We really lucked out in that. And then the other thing was that really informed the choice of camera. We went for a camera with a huge dynamic range, and that means that it can really capture some of the hot sunspots and some of the really dark shadows and then sort of make those look right. So we did test with multiple cameras beforehand and decided on that one for that ability itself. And then the indoor scenes were all shot with a low light camera, a Sony A7S, which can practically see in the dark. So we really chose the tool that we needed to get that across, and then wound up just doing a lot of color correction to make everything as smooth as humanly possible. I'm
curious about what months or what month you filmed inside of the park.
Let's see. It was Dapper Day in spring, so I want to say it was April. The majority of our park shoot was over 3 days, but one of those days, and some of the, I think, iconic looks are going to be from Dapper Day. So you have a lot of pretty dresses and bow ties in the background.
That is really interesting. And it's also oddly, I don't know if it was planned this way, but an amazing way of sort of saying everyone looks a little different today. Maybe they won't notice us as much.
It wasn't planned for that reason. Really, it was more of an aesthetic reason. The film is a lot about nostalgia. And you can't ask for any other day of the week, you can't ask for a full background of these nostalgic people walking into Disney World.
Now, you mentioned, of course, that you filmed in interiors and that sort of stuff. Where else did you film? And I believe it was all in the Orlando area, correct?
Yes, it was. So we had several places subbing for different parts of the Utilidors. One of those was Fashion Square Mall. You go a little bit deeper, and we're in the back of Boardwalk Bowl on Colonial. You go a little bit deeper, and we are in the cryogenics room itself, which was located in Orlando Brewing Company.
That's awesome. And I'm imagining you found all these places more than welcoming, especially opposed to sort of other locations that you were at.
Yeah, no, there was a lot of you're doing what now? The stories about what now? But a lot of people were really on board once we kind of told them and explained what was going on. And, a lot of people who have locations like that are just interested in watching the process work. So, our biggest 2 shoot days as far as the size of the crew were probably 50 people on crew. And that was for the Orlando Brewing Company day because we brought in a wall and we, were setting up all these props and the lighting was ridiculous in there. Luckily, they have industrial power, so we can really do that to a T and craft the exact look we want. And then we just have to hope that our footage from the park comes together close enough that we can make it all work in post-production, which it did.
Now that you're looking back, if you were filming a sequel, what lessons do you think you learned after doing this first shoot that you would take with you?
I wish that we had shot a little more condensed. We did have a couple of larger breaks. But on the other hand, part of that is working on the budget level we are. Like, we knew we couldn't get the locations then, and so we have to take the locations when they'll give them to us instead of, going on set and building it on a soundstage. I think if I was going to do it again, I would try and limit the digital lighting that I would have had to do. We had to spend a lot of time in color correction and in trying to match sort of between a couple different cameras. But that also just comes with the territory. I'm not sure. I say all these lessons that I'd try and do next time, and I'm not sure if I'd be able to or if I'd just take the trade-off again.
Now that the film's in the can, as they say, where do you think people will be able to see it, or when do you think that'll be possible?
We are in consideration at 35 film festivals around the world at this point. And we have not heard back from them yet. We will let people know as soon as possible. We want a theater near you to be screening it wherever you are. And if you want a theater near you to be screening it, I think you should tweet at that theater and tell them that they should be screening it. AMC is not going to screen this, obviously, but independent theaters, small venues, and things like that. Coming up in the fall here, we are hitting the road hard for those type of venues. And we are really excited to get this out on the big screen and get this to places where people are going to see it. After that, and after we really feel like we've given a good big screen run, we'll be doing a VOD release.
Well, Ben Lancaster, thank you so much for joining us here on Dreamfinders.
Oh, thank you for having me.
And that's it for this episode of Dreamfinders. I'd like to thank Benjamin Lancaster for joining me, and keep a lookout for the further adventures of Walt's Frozen Head on VOD in the near future. You can learn more about the film at waltsfrozenhead.com. Our podcast artwork is provided by JP Tanner. Find his other work at tanwoodcreative.com. This podcast is distributed by WDW News Today, the world leader in Disney Parks news. Read all they have to offer at wdwnt.com. Dreamfinders is hosted and produced by yours truly, Nathan Hartman, who you can follow on Twitter at SomeStuffISaid. Tell your friends about the show, and I'd like to thank all of you that have given us a rating on Apple Podcasts. It means so much, and it helps to get the word out. If you haven't, please do. I'd really appreciate it. If you or someone else you know would make a great guest on this program, feel free to email me. It's dreamfinders@wdwnt.com. I'm Nathan Hartman, and remember, if we can dream it, then we can do it.